Hello students, welcome to a chess lesson where you will learn a new opening for the black pieces, which will be a new gust of wind. I hope that not only you will get more wins with black, but also have way more fun playing dynamical chess. I'm talking about an opening that's called the Budapest Gambit. It starts after white plays d4, black plays knight to f6, and after white's most popular move c4, we're going to be playing the move e5. Yes, it does sacrifice a pawn. The idea behind it is that after white takes the pawn, which is the main line, and actually the only move for white to play for an opening advantage, we're going to be playing knight to g4 and follow it up with natural developing moves to win the pawn back. This will include moves like knight c6, bishop b4 check, and queen to e7. However, before we analyze the main lines, I would like just for a minute to show you what happens if they're not accepting the gambit. The worst thing that could happen to you is likely you prepare a gambit and not take a look at all at what happens if they decline it, you play a game, and they don't take the pawn. So I think there are a couple of moves they could try. Let's first of all take a look at the move d5. So they're trying to claim the space advantage, they prevent knight to c6. Black gets a very decent game here after bishop b4 check. I think bishop d2 is the most natural, and black would play the move a5. This way we're protecting the bishop. Taking on b4 is not good because we win space as the knight can no longer go to c3, plus we activate the rook along the a file. So after a5, the most natural response seems to be a3, after which we could take on d2. For example, they could take with the knight, and the inclusion of the pawn moves a5 and a3 only benefit black. Here we could play a move like knight to a6. They cannot kick away our knight from c5 with b4, as our knight is also attacking that. Now we can castle, play d6, and the knight is going to be very beautifully placed on the square c5. Black is simply better here. Take a notice that we still have our good bishop by definition alive, the opposite color to our fixed pawns in the center, whereas white is remaining with their bad bishop, as it's the light color, and their fixed pawns on the central squares are also on the light squares. Another move that I could imagine your opponents can play would be simply to defend the pawn with e3. Here we can get a good game with simply taking on d4, landing a check on b4, and say after knight to c3 we could castle. This is just fantastic. For example, bishop d3, d5, and I think that there are absolutely no problems over here. If they take on d5, we take with the knight, they remain with the isolated pawn. At any moment we could take ourselves and give them an isolated pawn. We have rook to e8, after knight f3 it's possible to pin. There are simply no questions about where the pieces go out. We are first to castle, and black has simply a good game. Perhaps the last move that I could cover would be what happens if they take the knights out, for instance, knight to c3 or knight to f3. Here I simply recommend taking, especially if they play the knight first to c3, because after taking the pawn in the center and queen takes, obviously we can hit the queen with the knight, and here we seem to already be leading the development, and we'll be starting the game from likely already an equal position. Now let's take a look at the main line. Well, in the Budapest Gambit, we're going to try to play for tactical tricks, very active piece placement, and if white makes a mistake, they could lose the game on the spot at any moment, as there will be some traps that we will try to set up. But even if they play perfectly, I hope that with black we're going to get decent positions, and it's going to be easy to handle our position. So over here, there are a couple of main moves. Today I'm looking at the move bishop f4, and if our opponent is going to play knight to f3, for now I just recommend playing knight to c6. By the way, there is no need to change, even grandmasters can play knight to c6, and we're going to transpose to the line with bishop f4, as that is the most likely move that your opponents will play as of now. There is one more popular move over here, which is bishop c5, but it's a question whether bishop c5 is better than knight to c6. So let's imagine that our opponent plays bishop to f4 or knight f3, knight c6, and then bishop to f4, and we're gonna simply start applying the pressure on the pawn on e5. So they naturally defend it. Now we land the check before we play queen to e7, and white has a couple of ways to block the check. The main two moves that we're gonna be looking at today are going to be knight to c3 and knight to d2. Let's first take a look at knight to c3. Very commonly, Budapest players at this particular moment are playing queen to e7, which I believe is a little inaccuracy. Now white has time to play a move rook to c1, and notice that when you're going to be taking on c3, white is no longer required to take with the pawn, and they could just play rook takes c1, rook takes c3, not damaging their own pawn structure. For example, let's say we're winning the pawn back, knight takes, and knight takes, and then they start kicking away our bishop. It has no room to go, as everywhere it goes there will be likely traps, and actually black is losing a piece if they're trying to move away. So the best move is to take on c3, and after rook takes c3, this is a perfect position for white out of the Budapest. They get 2 bishops advantage, they have a developed rook already, and no damage in the pawn structure whatsoever. Instead of playing queen to e7, we first are gonna take the opportunity to take on c3, damage opponent pawn structure, and only then gonna play the move queen to e7. Notice how we're applying the pressure on e5, so white's only try to hold the pawn would be with queen to d5. And here the main move is f6, trying to attack it the 4th time and sacrificing a pawn. Well, rather we're not gonna win the pawn back and just gonna remain a pawn down. Or you could try online a tricky move queen e3. It's not so hard if they don't know what to do to find an antidote to this move, as we're attacking c3. And after, for example, rook to c1, we could play the move f6, attacking e5. Their best move is to take, knight takes hitting the queen, for example, queen d1 and d6, trying to not drop c7, and from here black has a couple of natural ideas. It's possible to try to take the pawn, bishop e6 and castles are one of the ideas to follow as well. Instead, the main move recommends f6, or the theory recommends the move f6, and because we're attacking the pawn already too many times, white kinda has to take on f6. There are some tricky players who think they can win a piece with e6, as this prepares this nasty trick. However, black will out-trick them by taking the pawn, queen h5 check. Seems like we're losing a piece. Surprise, surprise, there's e5, and black is getting the piece back, and from here black is objectively considered to be better. So instead, the theory suggests just to take on f6, after which black takes back on f6, and white's queen usually goes back to d3, as on d2 square, they're susceptible to the tempos. If black plays knight to e4, tempo losses, and if they go queen d1, of course, they go back to the original square, and they might be also taking away the square from the rook. And after black plays d6 to save the pawn on c7, we have the starting position of one of the main lines. White is a pawn up, but their pawn structure on the queen side is very damaged. We have double pawns on the c file, as well as isolated pawn on the a file. Black will also castle much quicker. You could notice that white takes 1, 2, and 3 moves to castle, and we're considering that black has compensation here for a pawn. White objectively will always be better in all of the openings, but black has a good game objectively and practically, and I see no reason to be discouraged from playing Budapest Gambit because of the position we see in front of us. From here, white has a couple of ways to develop. They could try e3, they could try to fianchetto the bishop. g3, the latter, is considered to be the main line. Briefly, we could take a look at e3, for example, castles, bishop to e2, and black starts dancing around. The move knight to e4 may prepare bishop f5 to hit the queen. For example, if they castle, after bishop f5, we're already threatening knight to g3, which would hit the rook and also hit the queen. So they try to get away from the discovery with queen d5 check, king h8, for example, rook ac1, and I love how one of the games was followed by g5, and then h5, and there has been a couple of grandmaster games from this position, where black is slightly bit better. Of course, we're risking at opening up our king. However, according to the main principles, the center is closed and there is no counterplay for white currently in the center, which allows black to attack on the wings. I think that there is no way to mess with the black's king for now. So as we go back, this doesn't mean that white always has to run into this attack. the main move for white would be knight to d4, but even here after, for example, knight to c5, queen to c2, and a move like knight to e5, castles and bishop d7, black still gets a position with harmonious development. We have straightforward rook to e8, pawns goes to the dark color according to the two bishop strategy. Our opponent has light and dark, we have light. Therefore, our pawn should defend the color that our opponent has a bishop off and we do not have. So since we do not have the dark square bishop, in general, dark squares are hurting for us, and we ask our pawns to defend those. By the way, if you would like a separate video on the two bishop strategy, let me know in the comments. I would love to do a video on that topic. And we have ideas like rook e8 and bishop a4. I think the position plays itself. I really think that black has no problems to make a couple of good moves and continuing the game from the practical point of view. As we go back, there's one more line that we have to cover over here, and that would be fianchettoing the bishop for the white pieces. For example, g3. From here we could play castles, bishop g2, and black is starting to attack the pawn on e2. We have the pin, also the rook is gonna come likely to e8. And the theory suggests castling, rook a to e8. White has, of course, many alternatives, just like in any other opening. After a move like e3, which tries to solve the problem of the bishop, I don't like for black that the bishop might run out of some squares. I think that after knight e4 and perhaps transferring it to c5, black has good game. I don't see that we don't have sufficient compensation for a pawn over here. I still see weak pawns and active pieces for black. Instead, usually masters try a move like rook e1, and after prophylactic king h8 stepping out of this diagonal, white has objectively slightly bit better position. After all, they're pawn up, but just look at black's pieces. Centralization, the bishop is also on g4 nicely placed, both rooks are on semi-open files, queen is active as well, still damage in the pawn structure, black has no weaknesses, safe king. I think that this is a decent position to play. Now it's time for us to take a look at alternative, which happened on move 6. Let's go from the very back. d4, knight f6, c4, e5, we're gambiting the pawn. Knight to g4, bishop f4. As we said, if knight f3, we're simply going to try and transpose to the same position. And after the check on b4, the other main line, which is actually the most popular move for white, is knight to d2. This time we cannot damage their pawn structure. That is the main difference. From here we're going to be playing queen e7, and we're almost sure to win the pawn back on e5, because the white's queen can no longer go to d5 to protect that pawn. Let's take a look at a few lines. First of all, the obvious, a3. They're trying to break the pin. Here we actually have a trap that is very famous. We can take on e5, and if they take on b4, that would be a very sad day at the office for white, since knight d3 is actually checkmate. They cannot take the knight because there is a pin along the e file. So it turns out that white likely has to take on e5, after which we take on e5 and again threaten the checkmate. So most of the people play the move e3. Now they're guarding the square d3 with the bishop, and so they're ready to take on b4. The main line, and most of the people suggest bishop takes d2. However, I'm going to show you a tricky move. A tricky, cheeky little move. Bishop c5. At first, it seems like it's terrible, right? We're just running into b4. Well, I say, what about bishop d4, right? So the idea is that if they take on d4, it's a sad day at the office for white. We have a checkmate with a double check. So it turns out that our bishop cannot be touched, and most people online play rook to b1. They're scared of rook c1 because of bishop b2, but actually we can never take there as our bishop is getting trapped. I don't think we have to go into too many details there. It won't make a huge difference, but let's say rook to b1 because that's what everyone is going to play, and rook b1 and rook c1 are even objectively equal in evaluation. So black is going to be playing d6, and black is going to be playing d6. After bishop to e2, we're still going to be ignoring the threat of them taking our bishop and play very active move bishop f5, which hits the rook on b1. Once again, if they take, we have knight to d3. They cannot take the knight due to the same pin, and after king to f1 they lose the right to castle and we win the piece back since knight d3 was a fork. So as we go back, after bishop f5, it turns out that the rook has to move, and then we could play the move knight to g6, hitting the bishop on f4, for example, bishop g3, bishop f6 going back, castles, and I think black has a very playable position. Two bishops nicely placed, and okay knight, very solid position. I can leave you with this position and sleep well at night. So as we go back, this was the line if they play a3. Now let's take a look at what if white doesn't waste a tempo on a3 and simply develop their army with e3 right away. We're going to be winning the pawn back with knight e5, it takes, and bishop e2, a3 once again would lead to the same thing. We have castles for black, castles for white, and now since white is threatening knight to b3, and our dark square bishop will almost run out of squares, it is recommended to take on d2, and after white takes on d2, we play d6. From here, white has a stable plus, we're no longer a pawn down, but white has two bishops. I recommend starting with ideas like a5, solidifying the knight on c5, play rook to e8, our light square bishop has no problems to be developed, and playing a very normal position if white avoids all the traps, know all the theory. This is one of the best positions they could get. If you enjoyed today's video and my explanations, you can consider hiring me as your personal online chess coach. My contacts are on the right. Please leave me a comment if you think of a good topic of what should be my next video. Thank you for watching and see you in the next class.